There was a file labeled First Decoration Day, and I opened it, and here was a handwritten narrative on a piece of cardboard. At the bottom of it, it had a name, Berwick, but it listed a date and the New York Herald Tribune. I went over and got out the New York Herald Tribune for that date in late spring of 1865 in Charleston, South Carolina. And whoever wrote that down put the wrong date. I kept looking and kept looking and kept looking and kept looking, and finally, there it was. Verbatim, that story. It was describing a parade held in Charleston, South Carolina on May 1st, 1865. The Civil War had ended, just ended. Charleston had been evacuated by the Confederates back in February. The people left in Charleston, by and large, were all African Americans and Union troops, some white, some black. And the story on this narrative was people gathered on the old Planters horse track, the racetrack in Charleston. It was called the Washington Race Course, and they held this extraordinary parade. In the last 6 to 8 months of the war, the Confederates had converted the infield of that racetrack into an open-air prison, and about 260 Union soldiers had died of exposure and disease, and they'd all been thrown in a mass grave out behind the grandstand of the race course. We now have photos of that grandstand. The story was just almost unbelievable when I first read it. About 10,000 people marched around the old Planters race course. And the oval is still there in a park. But it said it was led by some 2,000 or 3,000 black children carrying armloads of roses and flowers and singing John Brown's Body, followed by black women, black men, and then Union troops. And they marched around the course, and then they gathered in this cemetery that had been created by local black workmen, as many as could fit into the cemetery, and they heard preaching from 5 black ministers, according to this article, and a small black children's choir sang the national anthem, America the Beautiful, and 3 or 4 spirituals. After this ceremony, broke up and went back into the infield of the old racetrack and did what most of us do on Memorial Day. They had picnics, they had a speaker stand with speeches, the children ran around. But back around the graveyard, they had built a fence all the way around it, and they whitewashed the fence, and they had an archway, entryway, and over the archway they painted the inscription, Martyrs of the Race Course. These were the freed people of Charleston paying tribute to the Union dead. And it was their way of declaring the meaning of the war. That's the first Memorial Day.
Listening to Reset Race, you're now tuned in to Reset Race. You're listening to Reset Race, you're now tuned in to Reset Race. What? Put them back on the grill again. We grilling them, put them back on the grill again. We grilling them, put them back on the grill again. We grilling them, back on the grill again. We grilling them, You're listening to Reset Race. ADOS need reparations to make America great. You're tuned in to Reset Race. We no longer starving while others eat off our plate. No. You're listening to Reset Race. We focused on our justice claim. We know what is at stake. You're tuned in to Reset Race. You'll find out who really about justice and really who fake. Lineage go back to US Southern plantations. Lineage, Jim Crow and mass incarceration. Redlining lynchings, we are old from this nation. You're not about justice if you ain't for reparations. MG the wise one, cousin mother intellectual. Samantha bringing fire, anti-black, we pressing you. No permanent friends and no permanent enemies. The backbone of the country, the win, you need our energy. You gon' see? Listening to Reset Race. You're now tuned in to Reset Race. You're listening to Reset Race. You're now tuned in to Reset Race. Put them back on the grill again. We grilling them. Put them back on the grill again. We grilling them. Put them back. Back on the grill again, we grilling them. You're listening to Reset Race. Ados need reparations to make America great. You're tuned in to Reset Race. We no longer starving while others eat off our plate. No. You're listening to Reset Race. We focused on our justice claim. We know what is at stake. You're tuned in to Reset Race. You'll find out we're really about justice and really who fake.
Welcome to Reset Race. My name is John C. I am an average American Negro, back with the family. We got a special guest here today. Well, before I get into this, usually when you hear me hosting the show, that means that we're going to be talking about things dealing with our culture. So we just did one episode about our dialect, and now we're going to talk about our food, which is a big staple of any ethnic culture. And we got a special guest here today. So we're going to let our guest introduce herself and tell them a little bit about herself. Adrian, introduce yourself to the people.
Yeah, I'm Adrian Miller, the soul food scholar. My tagline is dropping knowledge like hot biscuits. That's what we're going to do now. I am a former attorney. That was my legal training, was my initial profession. I'm a former politico, worked in the Clinton White House and for Colorado governor. My day job now is I'm executive director of the Colorado Council of Churches, but I'm also a certified barbecue judge, and I took this pivot, so I'm a food writer. So I've written books on the history of soul food, Black chefs in the White House, and African-American barbecue.
All right. Woo. Yeah, I told you you'd be coming up. All right, so let's go to my sister. All right, well, Sister Morgan. No Joe Morgan, no Jonas Morgan. Introduce yourself, sister.
Hi, I'm Morgan Malachi. I'm from Philadelphia. I'm an activist. You can find me at Cali Tastas on Twitter. And I've been a chef basically since I was 17 years old. So it's nice to meet you, Adrian.
Yeah, good to meet you.
All right, for sure. All right, let's go to the police. Sam, talk to the people.
So I'm Sam, aka the Khaleesi. You can kind of find me on Twitter. I'm excited to be here with our guest. So unlike normal, I'm going to keep it short.
All hell King Killmonger. That's all we got to say. Joey, where you at, bro?
You already know. All hail King Killmonger. The last living American patriot, leader of the resistance, and self-proclaimed king of the Negroes. Back again with the family. Let's get to it.
All right, for sure. And last but not least, my big cousin Mud. Cousin Mud, introduce yourself, cousin.
What's up? They call me Mud. You can find me on my social media at Of Lineage. That's OF Lineage, Twitter and Instagram. Creator of Bitter Dose TV. Let's go ahead and get into the show.
All right, so soul food. Typically, I guess, when it comes to Black Americans, for some reason, when it comes to our dialect, our music, people try to act like these things are not like real parts of an ethnic culture. And that particularly happens in soul food, where they say, "Oh, this is slave food. This is just, it's not really a cuisine or food." So, first question I got for you, Adrian, is when did you start getting into the cuisine, basically the cuisine or our food, and what made you want to dig deep into the origins of soul food, Black American cuisine?
Yeah, so the short answer is unemployment. So I was working in the Clinton White House, and at that time in my life, I wanted to have a life in politics. So I was trying to get back to my home state of Colorado so that I could start my political career. But the job market was really slow. I was watching a lot of daytime television. I said, I should read something. So I went to the local bookstore and I got this book on the history of Southern food written by this guy named John Adrian. And in that book, he said that the tribute to Black achievement in American cookery had yet to be written. And I thought, well, that's interesting. The book was 14 years old when I picked it up. So I just emailed him out of the blue, and I just said, wrote to him and said, "Hey, Mr. Edgerton, you wrote this. Do you think this is still true?" And he said, "Yeah, nobody's really taken on the full story. There's always room for another voice, so why not yours?" So seriously, it was that one sentence in that book that started me on the journey. And so that led to my first book on soul food. So to do that work, I read 3,500 oral histories of formerly enslaved people. I read 500 cookbooks, not all of them African-American authored, because I wanted to put African-American food traditions in a broader context. So I was looking at cookbooks from Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, all over the place. And then I read thousands of newspaper, magazine articles because we have these companies, including the Library of Congress, who are digitizing these old newspapers and magazines, and they're word searchable. And then because I care about my subject so much, I decided to eat my way through the country. So I went to 150 soul food restaurants, 35 cities in 15 states. So
God
that's
damn, you mean you might 135 soul food? God damn, that's a lot
yeah,
of
100,
lot of
150,
biscuits,
bro.
man. That's a lot of cornbread right there, bro. A lot of
Yeah,
cornbread.
yep. All in the name of research, though, right?
Amen. Amen. For the ancestors. For the ancestors. But I'm sorry. Continue, please.
So, so yeah. So when I first started it, given that one sentence in the paragraph, I thought the book I was going to write was going to be the definitive history of African American food, cuisine, culture, cooks, all of that. Because I'd reached out to some older African American food writers who were more well established, and I asked them, just to make sure that they agreed with Adrian, and they did. And they said, "Well, look, you're not going to find that much because this country is racist and our history has never been really told." But once I got into the internet, bro, I mean, there's so much stuff that I was finding. So what I found is that our story has been told because Black cooks were the face of Southern cooking and barbecue and a lot of traditions. And the ways that Latinos dominate commercial kitchens today, that's what Black folks did 100 years ago. So the history's there. We just haven't retold it. There's a bit of shame about it. And one thing I'll leave with you is, if you think about it, every aspect of Black culture, American Black culture, has gone global. The way we talk, dress, entertain, play sports, clothes we wear, all that stuff, except our food. And I think we just have an attitude about our food. And so we don't have cheerleaders for it in the way that we do for other parts of our culture. And so to the extent that our food does go global, it's disconnected from African Americans. And another example I'll give you is the 1619 Project, right? Wonderful work, next level, not one thing about food. So the question is, what is that? And I think it's because there's this stigma that this is slave food that's been forced upon African Americans. And so it doesn't recognize the complexity and the artistry of this thing we call soul food, which really brings together the culinary techniques, traditions, and ingredients of 3 different places: West Africa, Western Europe, and the Americas. So much of my work has been trying to get people to understand that story and to embrace it and not run away from it.
That's so. Here, I grew up in kitchens with all Black men, and my kitchens were male dominated, Black male dominated, even when I became a head chef. And I said recently that I feel like because of the change in the kitchen, the culinary taste of America is also changing. I see it in little subtle ways, the condiments on the table, the hot sauce, I see those things.
Absolutely. And, what would be interesting is to go back 100 years ago and see how we had influenced the American table in those subtle ways as well. Because any restaurant, German restaurants, Italian restaurants, a lot of them had Black cooks right alongside the cooks of that tradition. So we had a role and an influence.
All right. Well, let's 100 years ago. Let's go back further. Then let's go back as far as you can to the origins of our cuisine. Our soul. Can you kind of try to give kind of like a general explanation, like of the origins of soul food? That has West African influences. That has European influences, Native American influences, and maybe something else. Who knows? So you can explain to the audience, something about like the origins of our food.
Yeah, so Black people did not come here as blank slates. They came here as human beings that had their traditions, their way of doing things, and they brought ingredients. Things like okra, black-eyed peas, watermelon, sesame seeds. They called them bene. And familiarity with ground nuts, peanuts, sweet potatoes, all kinds of stuff. And so they bring that to the Americas. And slavery was segmented. So, the big plantations, like what you see on Gone with the Wind and things like that, that was only really 40% of where enslaved people live. Most people were enslaved people were on small farms. So on those small farms, they often ate out of the same pot as the slaveholder because it didn't make sense to have a separate team of cooks. But on those larger plantations, you had a separate team of cooks. But grossly overgeneralizing, the typical day for an enslaved person was you got up before dawn, You usually fed out of a trough, and the trough was filled with buttermilk and crumbled up cornbread, something like that. You had to eat with your fingers or some kind of seafood shell, because you weren't going to get a knife or fork because that's a potential weapon, right? And our people were about resistance, so every opportunity they had, they took it. And so they had to do that. And then they had to go work in the fields. And there was a separate team of cooks for them, in the field hands, as well as the people working in what was called the big house where the slaveholder lived. So two separate teams of cooks. And then middle of the day, that same trough would have been washed out and then filled with seasonal vegetables. Maybe there was a little bit of meat to season them, but not much. You got water. And then at the end of the day, you got the leftovers from that midday meal, and that was called supper. Usually you didn't get this until after the sun went down, right? Because people worked from sunrise to sun up to sunrise or sunset. So that was the typical schedule. Now, on the larger plantations and even on the small farms, the work schedule usually slowed or stopped by the time you got to the noon on Saturday. So enslaved people had the rest of Saturday, all of Sunday off until Monday morning when they had to start working again. So that's when they did gardening, foraging, hunting, fishing, all these other things to supplement their food. They could do the things that took more time, like barbecuing, making cakes, some of the things we think of, making fried chicken, some of the things we think of today for soul food. And so what I tell people is during the week, eating those seasonal vegetables with little or no meat is very close to what we call vegan today. And so the way, and Black veganism is huge right now. So I tell people it's not a departure from traditional soul food. It's really a homecoming.
I'm going to cut you off. I'll let you keep going.
Yeah.
But so you're telling me that slaves didn't eat hog maws and chitlins every day and black eyed peas and hog maws every day? That's what you're telling me? Because that's what I've been hearing.
Yeah, no, man, that was special occasion stuff. So they may get a little pork to season those vegetables, but it wasn't like everybody got that in their portion, right? So the things when we think about chitlins and hog, a lot of this stuff was special occasion food. Once a year they would have a hog killing, and that's when a lot of that stuff was available. But no, they did not regularly have access to that. And so it was a special treat. And you'll see that if you look through the oral histories of enslaved people, they note these things and they talk about how, how uncommon it was. And things like white sugar and white flour, that enslaved people did not get access to those things because those were considered prestige ingredients. So a lot of the stuff that we think of soul food today, that's really the celebration food of the South. And what I argue in my book is that soul food, as we understand it, is really the immigrant cuisine of the millions of Black people who left the South during the Great Migration and settled in other places. And they did what any other immigrant group does. You get to the new place, you try to recreate home. And if you can do it with the exact same stuff, you do it. But a lot of times you can't, right? Because you're in a place where certain things won't grow, or that stuff can't get to you by train or truck. And then you're living with people you're not used to living with. So you've got people from Asia or Central Europe or other places, and you start looking at what they eat and starting, mimicking it or incorporating it into your diet. So soul food has a lot of overlap with Southern food, but I think it's something different. And for those who live in the South who are listening to this, they're probably saying, well, we don't even really call it soul food that much. It's just home cooking or country cooking. It's really outside of the South that soul food has more currency.